Did you lose your ancestor in the records? Not sure how to pick up his or her trail once again? Well, in this video, I'm sharing with you 15 strategies to start finding your ancestor once again. Hey there, if we haven't met before, I am Lisa with Are You My Cousin? And this YouTube channel is designed to help you find your ancestors, grow your family tree, but not be overwhelmed in the process. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you're in the right place. Now, today's video is sponsored by newspapers.com. And the thing I love about newspapers is the fact that, well, they function as time machines. They are the largest newspaper archive online. Don't you just love newspapers? They're sort of like a time machine, really. So with newspapers.com, you can dive into an extensive collection of newspapers and start exploring history as it happened. That is, your ancestors' history, what was happening to them and what they were seeing each day and hearing each day. You can explore that in the newspapers. After all, newspapers.com has over 800 million digitized news pages, and they span 3 centuries. It really is an unparalleled gateway to the past. For listeners of today's video, newspapers.com is offering 20% off the publisher's extra subscription. Just use the code AreYouMyCousin at checkout, and you're on your way to explore that extensive collection of newspapers at newspapers.com. All right, so today I really want to take some time and share with you 15 different strategies that you may not have thought of that could help you perhaps pick up that trail of that ancestor. Because face it, we all lose our ancestors in the records sometimes. I know I do. I certainly have lost my ancestors and had a hard time really figuring out what my next step was. So I'm going to actually share some slides with you, and we're going to talk through 15 different strategies to help you start to pick up that trail again and figure out what that next step could be for you.
Okay, the first strategy when it comes to trying to pick up the trail of your ancestor, once again, is to have a research plan. Guys, as researchers, we've got to know what it is very specifically that we're looking for, and we need to have a plan that we can follow to find those records. Sometimes it's a great place to brainstorm those new ideas on different record sets you might not have looked at. That research plan might include checking other databases, but we want to make sure we have a plan that we're staying on track. Now, I have done a video on genealogy research plans and how to create one and be successful with that. So I will link that in the comments below, and feel free to take a peek at that once the video as your next video choice. Now, the second strategy that I personally use is I use timelines, guys. I rely a lot on a timeline. Sometimes I'm going to use it within a genealogy database. Sometimes I'm going to use a spreadsheet, and sometimes I'm going to use paper and pencil. Whatever works the best at the moment is really what I go with. But the important thing with a timeline is the fact that it allows you to identify gaps. So you can actually see, wow, I didn't realize I had this huge gap where I don't have any record for this gentleman for a 20-year time span. Well, that might then be your next research place that you want to research him, that part of his life. You might realize by looking at that timeline that, I have him, if he did all of these things, he's 150 years old. And obviously you have something either incorrect or most likely you're looking at 2 men. So this is a great way. Timelines are a fabulous way to help sort out when you have multiple men of the same name. It helps you to sort out those individuals by putting them on a timeline using time and location and looking at the patterns that you see there. Now, guys, I think one of the biggest things that I would tell you when it comes to research is to slow down your research. This may involve going back and looking at some things again because you looked at them too quickly, but slow down in that record. Make sure you are getting everything you need from that record. Make sure you understand what the record says and identify all the people who are in that record and find out how they are related to the individual that you're researching. So don't rush. We get in such a hurry. It's very easy to, on the databases where they tell us, oh, we found your ancestor in this record and that record. And it's very easy to click through because we get excited, right? But don't. Just sit down, sit with those records and really spend some time in them so that you understand what they are and what they say. Now, that really leads into this fourth strategy, guys, and that is to make sure that you understand the reason behind a record. In other words, understand the reason a record was created and what it is actually telling you, what type of information they were gathering and what that information was to be used for. That way you will understand what it is saying about your ancestor. It may also tell you a little bit more about why your ancestor didn't appear in a particular record set. Maybe your ancestor just wasn't eligible at that point in his or her life. So make sure you understand the reason behind a record. So for instance, think about a tax record. All right. Obviously, we had tax lists that wanted to, collect the taxes so they could run the county, run the state. But think about, not only was it to gather money, but there were also rules about who was required to pay those taxes, right? Sometimes people of certain ages were aging out of paying their taxes within a certain time period. So it's important that you understand, for the given time period that you are researching, you understand what that record is doing. What does it create? What type of information is it creating? And what were the rules or the laws behind that type of information? So, who would have been included and who would not have been included in that particular record. So make sure you take some time to understand the record itself before trying to interpret your ancestor within that record, to make sure you're interpreting your record correctly. All right, now number 5 is really probably one of my favorite strategies to do, and that is to simply start over. I do this with those really troublesome ancestors, those really tough brick walls. I really try to put aside my preconceived ideas about that person and put aside any ideas of what I know or what I think I might know about an individual, and I go back to the beginning of their research. I reanalyze all of the documents they have, create that timeline, create that research plan, and at that point, I'm able to hopefully have a fresh eye on the records. Now, why would I do that? Because, guys, I've been researching a long time, as I know many of you have been researching genealogy for many years longer than I have. But sometimes we forget to go back and reevaluate some of our older research because we have a better eye. We're better researchers. You've honed your genealogy research skills. You recognize things you might not have picked up on earlier. And also, you have more context for that ancestor. So I encourage you to start your research over on an ancestor if you're really stuck on that ancestor. Now, number 6, make sure you are going back periodically to check for newly updated databases. Obviously, we're in a digital world these days, guys. And so, the genealogy databases like Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, Family Search, they're adding new collections and new records for us to view online. State archives are doing the same thing. So we are seeing more and more records being digitized, certainly not everything, but go back and periodically check those that are pertinent to your research, because you just may find what you need. It just wasn't available, say, 5 or 10 years ago when you originally started researching that particular ancestor. Here's a tip, guys. Just put a calendar alert on your Google Calendar. Say for every other month, you'll go check a certain databases, and then you don't have to remember. You'll find it on your calendar and you'll be reminded that way. Make sure, guys, when you're stuck, take a deep breath and head into those special collections. Now, I know special collections can be, difficult sometimes to research. I think sometimes we avoid them because, as researchers, we're not as sure about them. Maybe we don't have as much experience in them. Oftentimes they're not online. They might be at the state archives or local archives, so we have to seek them out. They might be at a university library we would have to seek out. But I think we have to include special collections in our research, because we can find all types of things, everything from business. I've seen business records, I've seen letters, postcards, photographs between family members. And so I think this is a really important collection we want to make sure we're using. Now, I recommend watching the video I did on Archive Grid, because Archive Grid is a fabulous tool. It is free, and it allows us to search special collections around the world. So I'll have a link to that in the description below as well for a video tutorial that I did on Archive Grid. You definitely want to see that one. All right, so let's explore tax records, guys. Tax records are very helpful when it comes to your genealogy research. These are generally not going to be the first records you go to. I will tell you that. It can be a little tedious, but the beauty of a tax record is if you're researching in an area, say where, say around the 1890 census time period. Well, the 1890 census didn't survive. It did exist, but it did not survive. So we've lost that, but tax records would still be available, right? So those county tax records could still be available. So you could get a subset of at least a partial population documentation for those tax records based on who was living in the area. So they would have most likely been, men, obviously, who would have been paying those taxes, but you might find a few women in there if it was part of an estate that you might see. But because individuals were required to pay taxes, that created records, and you can get these beautiful listings, which is a small portion of the population there in an area in a time period when the federal census did not survive. All right, track the neighbors, guys. Now, I've done this a lot, particularly in census records, because I don't know about you, but I sometimes lose my ancestors in a census record. If I'm tracking them from 1850 and then I see them in 1860, can't find them anywhere in 1870, but then I pick them back up in 1880. So what's happening? Why am I missing them in that 1870s census? Is it because they're not there? Well, I suppose that is a possibility. Usually what has happened is the handwriting was so poor or the transcription was inaccurate, so I wasn't able to find them in the census record with my searches. So what do I do when I've lost someone? I actually look for their neighbors. I look at that 1860 census and I say, okay, the Smith family was living next door to the Nathan Pierce family. All right. Well, I'm not related to Nathan Pierce, but he was my ancestor's neighbor. So let me see if I can find him in the 1880 census. Fast forward 1880 census, I find the Nathan Pierce family, and sometimes I can often find the neighbors are either in close proximity or still side by side with my ancestors. So, looking at that community and understanding the community by tracking the neighbors, you can track your ancestor as well. Now, number 10, this is really more for migrating ancestors. So if you have ancestors who were leaving, somewhere in one of the eastern states, and they're making their way supposedly out west. So supposedly, the plan was they were going to leave, Virginia, and they were going to make their way to Tennessee, and then they were going to, head to California. So what would happen? Sometimes they didn't make it all the way. And as a researcher, you're looking all over California, those western states, and you don't find them. So consider some of the migration patterns, those trails that were heading west, and can look at some of those areas where larger cities may have been, places where stagecoaches, places where wagon trains would stop over to either, let the livestock rest, if they needed to replenish their supplies, those areas, because it's very possible that your ancestor just stopped. Maybe they ran out of money. Maybe they just ran out of oh, wow, I really don't want to cross those Rocky Mountains. Maybe there was some reason they stayed for a while to replenish themselves. Maybe they just really liked stopping partway. Maybe they found friends and they found a good job. So they found maybe land that they wanted, that they didn't necessarily need to go all the way west, or they abandoned their plans to go further west. So look at those populated areas along the way and see if your ancestor might have been there as well. Number 11, you knew I was going to talk about newspapers. I just know it. So newspapers, obviously, I am in absolute love with newspapers and researching newspapers these days because I can find so much wonderful information. And I learned so much not only about my ancestors, but their communities. And when you understand the community that your ancestor lived in, you're going to have a unique perspective on that ancestor's life. You're going to start to understand, hey, now I think I get it. I think I understand why they left that area and went somewhere else. Or maybe I get it. Now I get why they stayed after this horrible natural disaster. Maybe a hurricane came through and destroyed something. And now you kind of understand how they stayed and how they built the community back up. Obviously, you're going to find things like obituaries in there, which are fabulous for us to look at. A lot of those older newspapers had these, and the local newspapers had these wonderful, wonderful community news news columns where they would talk about who visited whom and what was happening. And this is actually a place where oftentimes I'll discover the existence of the local churches in the areas where they talk about the church news and which churches are having revivals. So this is an area where I've actually been able to identify churches that I didn't previously know about that then were important in my research because I actually found my ancestors there. So understanding who and what was in the community is always important. And that brings me to read the newspaper. So not only do we want to search the newspaper for our ancestors' name, we want to read the newspaper to understand their their life and what was happening in their community. And then, of course, number 13, always consult the locals, because those folks who live locally, whether you may be talking to the reference librarian, they are fabulous resources for you. They know what was happening in the community. They know who to ask if they don't know answers to certain community questions, but also reach out to those local genealogy societies, those local genealogy researchers. They know what they have. They know some of the things that we would never think to look for. I had an instance where I was really trying to find marriage records for some ancestors and could not find marriage records in a county that had no significant record loss, but yet I was missing a significant number of marriage records. Turns out that a number of folks back in the day when the courthouse was being rebuilt or refurbished actually helped store some of the records in their homes to do their research while the courthouse was being refurbished. And as one local told me, I don't think they all made it back. Well, I still want to know whose basement some of these records could potentially be in, right? So anyway, talk with the locals, because they have knowledge that could be helpful to your research and keep you, they can save you time, they can point you in the right directions and give you some insight that you might otherwise miss out on. Okay, I love this one, guys. Get fresh eyes on your research. So just like you want to start over and look at your research, I find it incredibly helpful to talk with other researchers and even non-researchers to say, hey, look at this. Am I on the right track? Here's what I have. This is the way I've interpreted this. Is this what your interpretation would be as well? I can tell you that my dad, who is not a genealogy researcher or family historian, but is a retired engineer, makes me prove everything to him. He will definitely question me and make me prove, how did I understand that? What record showed me that? Show him that record, explain how that works. And by doing that, even though he's not a researcher, he has helped me tremendously really tighten up my research and realize and recognize vulnerabilities in that research that perhaps, I don't know that I have quite enough proof, or I didn't prove what I thought I did. So definitely get fresh eyes on your research. And if you're doing this with a fellow genealogist, just trade research. Look at each other's research. Pay them back for that. You look at theirs, they look at yours, and see if you can get some new insights into your research. And lastly, guys, take a break. Sometimes when we are so in our research, we cannot see the details anymore. I know what it's like to sit at that computer and spend hours looking for that ancestor, thinking, just one more record, I'll just check one more record set. And after a while, what happens is maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but I need to take a break. So I'm going to encourage you to take a break, get outside, move, walk the dog, whatever you need to do. Sometimes stepping away from your research, whether it's for a couple hours, whether it's for a couple of weeks, is good for your research, because you will come back refreshed and able to look at it again with those fresh eyes. So there you have 15 strategies to get you on that track to finding your ancestors once again.
Okay, that was 15 strategies that you can start to use to pick up the trail of that lost ancestor in the records. Now, if you would like to learn more about finding your ancestors in records in those tricky places, be sure and watch the video on your screen now.